Okay, let's get started then. So we're continuing our sort of deep dive into philosophy and the classics and all the rest with Plutarch. Now, the original sort of reading, I didn't require everyone to necessarily go into every single sort of pair of Greek and Romans. There's quite a lot in the work. I mean, it's not small, but there are some major ones that everyone should read, like Alexander and Caesar, and Lysander and Sulla. There are others, of course, as well, but it really goes into a comparison of each of these different individuals through history, looking at why they were important, at least to the Romans, to Plutarch, not necessarily important to everyone, but there's a critical aspect of this that teaches us through, well, basically biography. And biography is different to other aspects of history in that what we're doing is looking at the lives of individuals. So in analyzing these individuals, what we see is the sort of deep dive into why these people are virtuous, why they're doing something good, bad, or indifferent. And of course, we're looking now not at everyone, but only those who are what some people would consider great men. Now, great men being the sort of just take for humanity. I'm not going to go into he, she, identity politics or anything like that. I don't really care. It means humanity, and if you don't like that, too bad. So in the great lives, we're only going to be looking at people who Plutarch considered great. Now, this differs very much from, what do you call it, certain Russian author of War and Peace, who basically came out saying that there are no great men, it's all a function of history, and made a myth that Napoleon was only 5'2", and did his best to denigrate anyone who ever became great. Most people don't realize Napoleon was actually an average height male. He wasn't short, but that's gone down in history because of the novel War and Peace as being completely wrong. So let's have a look at some of the people in here. Now, if we're going through it, if we go through the whole lot, Theseus and Romulus, there's a reason why we have these two. We have the founding mythology behind the Greek society and the founding mythology behind the Roman society, although there are multiple sort of Roman sort of analogies to how everything started with both Romulus and Aeneas. And then we have the creation of law and order. So we have Sulla and Lysander. We have the implementation of rules with Solon, etc. And then we have the individuals who are conquerors, or the people who've either started or destroyed societies, depending on which way you want to look at it, with Alexander and Caesar. So looking at this, we're going to go through introductions here, the social aspects of history, and the differences between biography, historians, and psychology. And this is a very important aspect of why we look at these sort of works. We're hoping to capture not just what occurred. So in pure history, when we're doing a historical analysis of something, we're not looking at the individual. We're not looking at the psychology behind something, but we are when we are comparing people in biography. And the capturing of all of the different individuals in this analysis by Plutarch takes us into a way of not only looking at the individual lives, but comparing them against each other, looking at why they were virtuous, why they did things wrong, what were the good aspects of their life, what were the bad, and then how do we do things better. So an example here would be Alcibiades versus Coriolanus. Both of these were very deeply honorable men in their own way, but also came to a very negative end. So there's a very good play on Coriolanus by Shakespeare, not put out there to be watched often enough, in my opinion, but going into a person who doesn't understand the differences between the layers of society and won't bend. And because Coriolanus won't bend, he ends up having to attack Rome, but still won't go through with the end as Caesar did because of his sort of belief in Rome. So now, Plutarch really captures an early form of psychological analysis on each of the individuals that he's talking about. While we're not going to go into the post-Freudian sort of blaming everything on our mother type scenario, what we do have is why these people did it. So the opinion of another individual as to what the ideal is for how people act. Now, for those who don't know, I'll also throw in a bit of a plug. The Loeb, Loeb, Classic Library, dates to 1890s to the latest was 1923. So it is completely in the public domain. So if you want, you can download it. You can have PDFs of all this. Or you can buy the books like I do and still pay people money because they're printed, and it's free. So there's no excuse for any of these works not to be able to get a copy because the PDFs are open and available. So now, the study of history is also something that I'll keep saying is critically important. History teaches us sort of where we've gone wrong, what we've done wrong in the past, but it is more than what we try and say now about blaming things, but learning the good aspects of society as well. But studying biographical works goes beyond understanding what's occurred, but understanding those who have made history. So one thing that I will always recommend is people should read a lot more in biographies of people, current ones as well, not just people from the classic era, but great leaders and others who you might admire. And we also come to understand that not all great men, so to speak, are good. Sometimes we find out that people are human. They have their flaws, they have their foibles, they have good and bad aspects, and together we can see why people went wrong, how they went wrong, and some of the problems that occur. Now, when we're looking at lives, we see a series of biographies in Plutarch. So these are mostly arranged in pairs, although there are a few missing ones. And what we have are a series of a Greek and a Roman with similar destiny. So anyone want to sort of think about why Alexander the Great and Caesar would be put together? Any takers on that one?
Well, I would say because they were both great conquerors, and they both sort of met an ignominious end, although we're unsure whether Alexander was murdered, it's reasonable to sort of infer that something happened there, and Caesar was definitely murdered. Both were sort of emperors who took complete control, or Caesar claimed he didn't want to be emperor, but definitely, making himself dictator for life and all of those things were really acts that were everything but emperor. So
yes, I mean, in going back and forwards and rejecting being king, he did so in such a way that seemed to many in the Senate like he was just trying to push the people into continuously goading him into going, yep, king, and now obviously it's not me, it's the people. So
yeah, exactly.
So what I'll also say is when you're reading this, there are a lot of aspects of historical context, but Plutarch isn't really aiming to write a history. He's not trying to capture what has happened, how many battles have occurred, etc. But he wants to explore virtue and character. He wants to understand what makes someone good or bad in the lives and destinies of these individuals. How is it that they have become who they are? Whether it's men of action, whether it's achievement, whether it's the creation of something, or the ethics behind why they've done it. The historical value is there in capturing where people were, but the prime interest in Plutarch is ethics and virtue. He wants people to understand why and how and what has been occurring in people's lives. And in this, we sort of start to understand more of the actions that have occurred. There are supposedly a number of lost biographies. We don't really know because they're lost. But in theory, there are Themistocles and Camillus, Pyrrhus and Marius may be there, etc. So there may be some extras, but unfortunately, we don't actually really know unless someone happens to find it. So we have others such as Demosthenes and Cicero, and these are individuals who have basically created their own destiny through their word, through their views, through their life, through their ability to convince people through words. On top of that, we have others who are emperors. We have others who are soldiers and generals. Scipio Africanus is a good example. And then on top, you have really looking into the foundation of different aspects, not everyone, but really the aim is to look at and explore different aspects of virtue through all this. So when we're looking at this, we need to remember what we're capturing is the reason someone may have failed when they did, the reason someone may succeed, and the virtue and the psychological turmoil that people face. And all of this is really discussed in as much detail as you could expect, with biographers not having as much information as we would today, and summing up the essence of a life. So I guess we could say that one of the great things that I find in Plutarch is that, unlike people like a little while ago, I read the one of the official biographies for Margaret Thatcher, and there's a lot of history in there, and there's a lot of what occurred. But when you read Plutarch, he tries to capture the soul of the individual. So this is something I think we lose today when we're not focused on like why people do things, virtue, and we want to sit there and say that everything is comparative. Well, I don't believe it is. I mean, when we think about virtue, whether we're talking now, Greece, Chinese society 3,000 years ago, etc., human nature is fairly similar everywhere. Like it or not, we love, we hate, we fight, we do all these other things. And these biographies give us examples of how individuals sort of grow and develop and become who they are. So Plutarch captures the good, the bad, and today what we would see is something like a comparison of a Churchill and a Stalin, which someone doing a modern version of this would be quite good in my opinion. So other aspects. We get into the social aspects of history. It's quite a large work. If you've actually had a look through, I've got a low-ebb version. I've also got an original that I was gifted many years ago from a 18th century sort of translation that I don't touch much because old books, although I like them, you touch them too much and they don't survive as much. Now, give me some examples of modern individuals you think would fit the same sort of realm of analysis.
But I'm going to also throw in Gandhi as an example.
Mm-hmm. And who would you put Gandhi against?
That's a tough question. Yeah, Gandhi against against one of the Greeks, ancient Greeks or Romans.
Well, I mean, part of what Gandhi looked at doing was peaceful resolutions. So you could probably do an analysis
Nelson Mandela.
A Nelson Mandela or someone like Dalai Lama. So you'd want to try and match people with similar views and similar ways of going through their lives, and then compare what he did, what they did, similarities, differences, and in doing this, we come to understand people.
Hodor, would you like to ask or add something? I can see your hand is up.
Yeah, sure. So Craig asked who else like of a more recent time would be kind of worthy of that analysis, and I was thinking maybe Eisenhower.
Mm-hmm.
Slightly different. He didn't take over in an authoritarian way, I guess, but not to use that term the wrong way, but a dictator, but still was part of the conquest that led to a different paradigm in the world.
I was going to say someone like George Washington or Ulysses Grant, some of the early American leaders.
Yeah, and then you've got people like Wilson, Lincoln, etc. Some of the earlier presidents, some of the great generals throughout history. Why they have these things, why they did what they did, what they are as an individual. And that's something we don't like to look at now. And we have this idea that we need to sit there and go, oh, that person owned slaves. Well, lots of people in history owned slaves because practically everyone did. If we go back to Greece and Rome, everyone had slaves. There's actually a really weird scenario where in Rome, it was possible for a slave to own a slave, which is sort of, I find really weird. It's sort of like turtles and pot of turtles. It didn't happen often, but occasionally you'd have a slave who was rather high up in society. For instance, someone who was a scribe or a scholar who was a slave, but earned a lot of renown and fame, and was still a slave. There were a number of people working for Julius Caesar directly who were in charge of armies, etc. And the same thing happened later in Islamic history, where the leaders and main people in society were brought in as Christian slaves and trained as youth and children to run everything when they were young enough, trained when they were young. And the rulers would actually be a slave as well. It's a weird scenario for us, but understanding all of this helps us to understand what happened, why it happened, etc. So going further, we have many of the works of William Shakespeare ended up as plays based on Plutarch. Around the time that Shakespeare started writing, shortly after Marlowe had been producing plays, the translation of Plutarch that came out was quite common. And the events and how they're described within many of Shakespeare's plays directly translate from the work of Plutarch. The distinction is the character development of Shakespeare is way deeper than anything that Plutarch ever did. Plutarch captured like what the psychology was, but Shakespeare made the characters human. So looking at things like Coriolanus or Julius Caesar or Antony and Cleopatra, Shakespeare then takes the work of Plutarch and transforms the psychology of the characters into something that we can see and experience and feel. So I don't know if any of you have seen any of these plays that have been done well, but a good Shakespeare play captures the soul of the individual and transmits it across time and space to us. So the early translation of Plutarch, like the 16th century one, has been utilized and reutilized. It was republished around just before Shakespeare started really working. And one of my favorite plays remains Coriolanus, for my own reasons, but I find him a very interesting character. So looking at all of this, we get to go into sort of why Shakespeare might have grabbed these individuals and written about them. So unfortunately, despite the fact that Plutarch was a biographer and wrote all about people, we know hardly anything about Plutarch himself. We know a little bit about he was born sometime between X and Y, and he died sometime between X and Y. And he may have had a daughter, and he may have ... but we don't really know a lot. So it's quite interesting that an individual who wrote so much about other people that many people know, that's gone down 2,000 years worth of fame, is also rather private. So now, next, the politics within what we see in Plutarch, despite the fact that we're talking about good and evil and right and wrong and what people have done, the work's rather apolitical in many ways. Plutarch's actually probably rather intelligent in that, in when he was writing. So anyone want to hazard a guess to when he was writing? It's not exactly known, but
maybe it feels like to me sort of in maybe 50 years after, or in the early times of the empire. So when Augustus was first really taking over.
Yeah, it was probably actually a bit later than that. It's probably around the time of Marius or something, like first or second century. But yeah, it's difficult to say, and there are different versions of what people say when it was actually written, etc. But and I'm not going to go into those debates. I don't think any of them matter.
So most of these stories would have been at least, I mean, even the most recent ones that he wrote would have been at least sort of 50
to 100 years after. Yeah, sometimes a lot later, of course. When we're talking about the early characters, well,
they would have been 1,000 years
100
old by
years,
then,
1,000 years. Yeah, I mean, Solon and Popolica, then we're looking at maybe 700 years difference. Pericles, maybe 600 years. So,
yeah.
And even the distinctions between individuals. I mean, Pericles was around 500 plus BCE. His contemporary in the book, Fabius Maximus, was around 200 to 270 years BC. So there's still a 200 to 250 year gap between the individuals. So Spartacus was 71 BCE, and other individuals, of course, are all different times. Spartacus, of course, isn't someone that you'd expect to be written about at the time. Any ideas why you really wouldn't expect Spartacus to be a major concern of?
Please do.
I think it's basically because he was a slave and he led the revolt again, the slave revolt. So I don't think they would want to actually remember as being.
I feel like he was a bit of an embarrassment.
Yeah.
Very much so. So Spartacus caused a lot of problems for many, many years. And although we now see that individual as taking a stand and rising up and is great, to the Romans, no. I mean, you didn't know your place. You weren't part of society. It's be a good slave and just do what you're told. But that doesn't make it right, but it's a difference in how they perceived things. So going back to all of this, what we're really looking at is Plutarch was addressing the problems that he saw with the sort of decay of virtue, the lack of morality and ethics that were being slowly inculcated across Rome. So in the early empire, things weren't too bad, but as we go further and further, we get into a state where the Roman Empire suddenly, well, not really suddenly, but slowly changes. It decays. The education of individuals was different, etc. I'm doing a dissertation on sort of this topic at the moment. That's due out later this year for one of my studies. But my personal theory is it was population. So my population analysis looks at the changing demographics, much as we have in our society. For Romans, most of the Romans had one child, maybe two. So the Roman population started declining, but what they did, like many of our European nations now, they brought in people from, well, in their case, the barbarians, the Germans, etc., because they needed young warriors, they needed young fighters. So you bring these people in, but you don't give them the same education, you don't inculcate them into society, and then you wonder why these guys, now they have guns, but back then these guys with armor and swords eventually get sort of peed off and take over. So train them to be Romans if you want to bring them in and make them soldiers. So the best aspect of all of these types of works is looking into the psychological aspect of the individuals and the soul of the person that he writes about. Montaigne notes that Plutarch doesn't really capture all of the history, but Plutarch never sought the history. And it's a work of moral instruction in many ways. So this has been taught within a lot of schools. It's been taught as part of the quadrivium and trivium in schools before we stopped doing that and got rid of the classics as a way of teaching people, well, virtue and why we're doing things. So if we think about it for a moment, it's a reason why people did the choices they make. So looking at all of this, we have a person who is a combination biographer, historian, sort of sociologist, and many other things, and going into why these people sort of succeeded. Importantly, many people will tell you today that it's all about the past. These individuals were lucky. They had good parents. They had a privileged background. But let's think about that for a moment. Even when we're talking about someone like Caesar, yes, he was from a good family, and he had sort of a long history, all that. So what? That doesn't mean that he becomes number one. Let's consider against Pompey for a minute. Pompey was one of Caesar's contemporaries. So was Brutus. Why aren't these individuals the people who became Caesar? Why didn't Mark Antony continue and go from being a general into ruling? Why did Cicero stop? So Cicero, of course, had a different idea and wasn't going to go against the Senate and saw the whole idea of collapsing the Republic as an anathema to all he believed. But not everyone does. So why the difference between these individuals? Just because you say someone has an elite background, an elite birth, or that they came from something, that doesn't mean that they end the same way. On top of this, some of the other individuals covered don't always have the same background. So although Scipio Africanus ends up a major general who conquers and has a name that is remembered for a long time, why? Why did he rise up from the rank of a knight to something far more? Why did others like Sulla, why did they get on and control sort of power through people? Why did Marius do that? The strength of someone like Marius was as a soldier and a general, and yet he also managed to align the people in Rome, pissed off the Senate quite a lot. So yes, and correct, Cicero conspired to assassinate Caesar. The reason being, Caesar was a threat to the Republic. So different individuals, despite seeming wealth or anything else that you can throw at them, have different outcomes in life. And you can't just say, this person's rich, so everything's done for them. Right now, we can see that in our current society. There are plenty of people who are wealthy and don't ever achieve anything. We have families who basically disappear. So how many people know the story of the Getty family? I know there's movies out there, but most of them are terrible. But if you think about the Getty family, Getty, oil magnate back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. He has, his house is owned by a Russian not too far from me right now. So the former Getty mansion is now actually down the road from where I live. But interestingly enough, if you think about it for a moment, Getty was a billionaire in the 70s, back when a billionaire was worth something. Probably the first billionaire. Now, let's consider what happened when he died. Yes, the family are worth a lot of money, but Getty Oil doesn't exist anymore. It disappeared very quickly.
So they basically sold it and did nothing with it. I'm assuming.
Interestingly, he has a book. He has a book called How to Be Rich, not how to get rich. And then the first paragraph he talks about anybody can get rich, but to be rich is a different story. And that's I don't know too much about the history of the Gettys, but I know they have a bunch of museums across Los Angeles. And I did read his book, How to Be Rich, which I thought was good.
Yeah, none of the family liked him because he, in their eyes, was too miserly. Hopefully, my family don't end up thinking that way of me, but I'm miserly in my own way. But now,
well, I think money gives you access. It gives you access to so many options, and just like it's like it can be too powerful, and you can get off on. So I think a lot of his kids had a lot of problems with drugs and stuff, but I don't know too much of the history. I did watch that movie though, which was I never trust Hollywood movies too much though, because they kind of will exaggerate things. So yeah,
they always change history a little bit just to make it more watchable, but which is a shame. I mean, it would be nice if they stuck to the truth, but even Shakespeare changes things to suit what he wants. If you think about, there's a movie out last year called The Norseman. If you look at the main character in it, his name was Hamlet. So, which in some ways was probably more accurate, although totally inaccurate in some ways as well. But everything being dirty, filthy, and having goats live inside your house was much more accurate than the 16th century portrayal of Hamlet, the 8th century prince, who, well, basically lived as if he was in a 16th century castle. So
I have a question. You were just talking about the greats and how they, come from different backgrounds and have a drive to be great. Is there a common denominator underlying, or can this drive to greatness have different denominators? So someone doesn't have to have XYZ, they could have ABC and still succeed in life in that path.
Depends on what you consider succeed in life. If you think about the choice given to old Achilles in sort of the Odyssey and other Homerian epics, then what we have is Achilles had the choice of a good life that was easy, long, family, but he was told he would not be remembered. No one would ever remember him. Alternatively, he had a choice of a life that was hard, that was short, that was brutal, but he would be remembered through history. Now, the Iliad, of course, has the beginning of that, where he's given that choice by the gods and chooses to go out there and have a blaze of glory. But in the Odyssey, when Ulysses is down in the underworld, he meets and talks to Achilles, and Achilles tells him he made the wrong choice. But then shades also deceive, so did he or didn't he? Or maybe he's just bitter when he's dead. Who knows? Lots of things we can consider. So some other bits to think about. Ethical virtue. There are different virtues, but there are things that align fairly much throughout history, apart from in our current woke culture, where we seem to like getting rid of virtue altogether. Things like industry, working hard, etc., have been considered virtues through a long component of history, really. It's generally when we get rid of those things that we have problems. Now, the next distinction is prose versus verse, and the poet, and there are plenty of those at the time as well, Lucretius, etc., they write in verse. The biographer here writes in prose, but good poetry itself is philosophical and it's deeper than pure history, but also a good biography captures the psychology of the individuals and helps us come to understand everything that's occurring. So history in all of this captures why. So Aristotle talks about ethics, of course. We've covered that in the past, and looks at singulars, the universal, the explanations of the logical aspects of ethics. Yet what we get in Plutarch is real world examples. So we take what we have from individuals such as Aristotle and we see why. Why are these people just? Why are they virtuous? Why are they industrious? Why are they ... Each of the different aspects of virtue that we can see. And there are different makeups from people depending on which ones we value more. So if we think about the Christian Catholic ideals of the seven deadly sins and the matching virtue, the idea there is ordered, of course, in Catholic literature, but if we reorder those, we get different individuals. And the same happens in Greek and Roman ideals. If we put different virtues in different orders, then we're going to have people who have very different outcomes. And if you think about even taking the differences in the negatives and the positives and what we get for all that, then we're going to be very different in how we behave. If we put different virtues in different orders, the outcomes are going to make very different people. Now, Caesar and Alexander, we've mentioned those already, but they're very different individuals despite the outcome of what they're doing and how. What Alexander did versus what Caesar did, different societies, and the Macedonian sort of creation of a kingdom or an empire, we can see why it collapsed as well. So despite Caesar coming in there and crossing the Rubicon and becoming a dictator, Rome didn't fall apart. So that's one aspect of the differences in what they did. Whereas as soon as Alexander died, everything fragmented. If we think about the Great Khan from Mongolia, everything fragmented again. So when we have charismatic leaders who are not basing things on process and structure, then someone needs to be able to replace them who is equally charismatic, or everything falls apart. Whereas when you have a charismatic leader who has process, then things can continue. Luckily for old Caesar there, his adopted nephew, Octavius, later, of course, Augustus, was also charismatic in his own way, very different to Caesar, of course. So we start to understand the differences and similarities between people when we look at them, and we can then look at the types of lifestyles they had. In both cases, there were aspects of living in decadence and living in luxury, but also living a restrained life. So while out campaigning, Alexander, of course, would manage supplies incredibly well. His logistics train was always well stocked. He knew what he was doing. He planned. But we see when he gets to sitting and ruling a kingdom, first thing he does is he gets the silk sheets and he takes a few extra wives, and he also enjoys
spends the whole time drinking.
Yeah, far too much. But then so did Philip, his father. So
yeah,
Plutarch,
he wasn't really interested in matters of state so much. He was just more interested in beating up the next guy and forwarding his own image, really. Whereas Caesar seemed, while concerned with building himself up, he did want a greater Rome.
Yep. So if we actually think about that, luxury for many of the Greeks and Romans is defined as something beyond what is necessary for sustaining a good life. Epicurus took that much further, but we're really looking at what is necessary. So in my case, I would consider having an excessive number of books as completely necessary, but that's my good life. My wife wouldn't agree with me, and the ever-growing number of bookshelves is something that she groans and moans about. I like my paper books. I've got a pile on Kindle, and I've got something like I've got 8,500 Audible books, for instance. And the problem I have with that is they're not NFTs, they're not captured that way. I might theoretically own them, but what happens if Google, or for Google Books or Amazon or something like this, goes away, stops the service? Yeah, not good. All right. So luxury is really okay, apart from when we take it too far and create decadence. But yes, it's good to be king. Going into the Mel Brooks version of that is interesting, meaning of life type stuff. But Life of Alexander and Caesar, each are open to luxury, but they also still balance it. Unfortunately, Alexander also doesn't balance everything quite as well as he should. And we start to understand the individuals by looking at how they react, not only when they're working, but when they're not working. So who wants to tell me, why do you think Lycurgus what's his justification in the appointment of 28 senators?
I have a guess for this. It's not really well defined in the book. He never explicitly says this is the reason why. But one of the things that he sets in Sparta is that everyone lives in the same way. And one of those things is they have the meal groups where there's between 12 and 16 people who eat together every night. And they had the two kings in Sparta, and the 28 plus the two kings really made two meal groups who would have ate together every night, who would have discussed matters of state every night. And to have the two kings with the same type of group that everyone else was having sort of set that standard that this is the way we do things in Sparta.
So I'll ask a different question. Why did the American founding fathers create an aristocratic Senate that wasn't voted for by the people? That's changed now, of course, and now you get to elect senators.
Archie, would you like to respond to that one?
I think maybe because that was their way of preventing demagogues from influencing the masses, and then those elected representatives would be somewhat immune to that, possibly.
Yes, the founding fathers feared democracy. The American founding fathers, that is, of course. Demagoguery, those who can sway the masses, well, they can make changes to society that have long-term negative impacts. And not everyone reasons. So yes, we want people to understand, but we also want them to balance against the different aspects of society in like business and ensuring that really that we have no individual group too powerful. And this is where people go wrong today. So the appointment of 28 senators really limited the amount of power that anyone had, balanced the kings, balanced the other individuals, and split power between things so that it couldn't be easily abused. But now we try and give too much power to democracy, and we say that we need democratic rights, but we have democratic rights. The issue is people forget that it's not now. Society is based on those who went before and those who will come after. So we can think that we rule right now, but what about the people who built society? So if I leave a legacy, then why do you have a right to remove it? Oxford at the moment, university. The problem with Oxford University is you go out there and you look at where your money's coming from, and then you shit all over it and go, oh, Cecil Rhodes was a terrible, terrible person. He said naughty things. Usually cherry picking his arguments and not actually listening to the full thing. The part of Cecil Rhodes that everyone forgets is, although yes, he said these Africans are young, naive children, and like if he said the blacks aren't ready to rule themselves, but then he said afterwards, but we need to make sure that we educate them so that they are, which
Leslie?
no one ever reports.
Sorry, Leslie wanted to input something on the topic before we move away from the topic. And also, can I just throw in as well, it'd be nice to have some more questions from the end chain lot. We haven't seen many questions from you guys. I am looking forward to see some. Leslie, if you can unmute yourself and throw in your input.
Thank you, Joel. Yeah, you can hear me okay, right? Okay, good. Yeah, what I was going to say is I could see that Lycurgus, if I'm saying that right, it was mentioned that he saw the swings between despotism and too much democracy. And we're seeing a lot of democracy now, but he saw it at that time and made the Senate to try to help balance the mob rule of excessive democracy with a tyrant, with tyranny. And it worked decently for, I guess, 500 years until it didn't. Still, it was what his system was similar to communism, socialism, removed all luxury for fear of decadence.
There's a problem with democracy that whether we're looking at sort of de Tocqueville talking about it or others, has been documented for a long time. The education of people isn't democratic if you want it to be creating people who value democracy. To value democracy, we need a process that is going to accept that there are hierarchies and there are individuals, and to teach them that there are different values and different aspects of society, and while we're all equal under the law, that doesn't mean that we have the right just to go and do what we want. And equally to train those people who think that they're rich and they're self-made, so that means that they don't need to do anything because it's, well, I can ignore everything. The interesting aspect of English society, British society, with the aristocratic sort of foundation of that was that the aristocrats owed something to those who they governed. So because you're wealthy doesn't mean that you get out of everything going, I'm wealthy. Rather, it meant that you now are obliged to society because it's, well, otherwise you're going to end up pissing them all off and they're going to crush you anyway. So not even just that, but as someone who was gifted with much more than you owe those who have much less. But that, of course, disappeared with the rise of early capitalism in the 18th century, when the aristocrats were replaced by sort of, well, sudden increase in wealth, technologists mostly. So we're finding it again today. We find today in Silicon Valley a whole lot of technocrats who believe that because they've gone from very little money to well, not always very little money, but comparatively little money to being multi-billionaires that they are owed rather than owe. So I'm the weird other side of that, but anyway, that's a different matter. So yes, so what we're looking at is creating something that balances the different areas of society and creates something that won't collapse, that will be supporting itself over time. And right now, we can see by looking at what we're doing in our own society that we're rejecting these areas that, well, uphold democracy and liberty. And we're doing it because, well, business said we need people trained in X. Well, think about this for a moment. A liberal education, what does it teach you? It teaches you history and ethics and virtue and how to be a political animal, someone part of society, someone who can fit into a democratic or republican system. Now, you can argue that that doesn't teach you the skills necessary to be a developer. But isn't our duty to society developing people who aren't necessarily going to be the best C developers right at the moment, but the best citizens? Of course, companies can pay to develop people and give them those skills. Vocational training doesn't need to be the part of society that we give. Education should be. And these are very different concepts. And when we talked about the collapse of Sparta, in part that was because they looked backwards too much and didn't go forwards. They didn't develop, they didn't extend things, but also society again became less of what it was. It embraced a lot more of the other societies they had in a bad way. And by a bad way, I mean they didn't embrace the best of Athenian culture. Many Spartans ended up going out there and enjoying the worst of Athenian life. By worst of, I mean they got drunk and they did everything that was non-Spartan. So, as these things happen.
I thought it was interesting in the Federalist Papers. They do describe some of these early societies, and they basically describe the Spartans as really nothing more than a well-organized military camp. And I thought that was pretty apt.
Well, yes, and although Athens burnt a lot of their money effectively in trying to extend too much and become more like the Spartans, when they grew through open liberal sort of means, through sending out colonies that wanted to be colonies, by allowing people to be part of their alliance, then they grew quite well. It's when they decided to mirror the Spartans and become more warlike and try and become an empire that everything fell apart for them as well. So, interestingly enough, many of these problems are ones that we see today. So we see the same issues. People say, oh, we don't need to learn history because it's all different. But when we look at the biographies of people in the past, we find out that it's not that different. The underlying feelings, the reasoning, the sort of resentment people feel, the joy and happiness that people feel are the same. As humans, they don't change a lot.
We're still humans living the human experience.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Human emotions, and yeah.
And to sit there going, we've got better technology. So what? Better technology doesn't change us. I mean, we can spend more time on our mobile phones, and we can access more information than we ever knew what to do with. But if we don't know what we're trying to search for, then who cares?
Means we can
Which is
kill
part of the
ourselves
problem.
more efficiently, quicker.
Oh, I think we're already there. Why? So another one. Caesar rejected the crown multiple times. Did he want to be Roman king, do you think, or do you think that was a ploy?
I think he wanted to certainly be the ruler of Rome, and whether he was called king, he didn't really care. I think he knew that in the public's eye, he was the supreme ruler of everything. And the name didn't really matter all that much to him.
And what do you think happened as a comparison with old Mark Antony there?
Mark Antony sort of, I think he was fell in love with Cleopatra and sort of lost the zeal to be a ruler of something greater than himself. He sort of went down into that whole of.
Was it? I mean, in part, yes, but do you think it was more decadence and luxury?
Definitely,
I mean,
that had
if you
something
think
to do
about
with
the
it.
lifestyle in Egypt, that could also account for some of it too.
Mhm.
I mean, Caesar actually went down and tried it for a little bit, but at least he left and came home.
And we had a question from Didi.
Yeah, I always looked at it the other way around. I always looked at it that Caesar actually didn't want to be king, and that he was elected, but he actually liked the idea of the equality, and he didn't really want to lead that kind of decadent life. Whereas Mark Antony, I kind of saw that as a more of a political kind of reason. Yeah, they had a relationship, but I always saw that as a more of a political reason of why he actually got with Cleopatra for different purposes, for being able to rule over Egypt. So I saw it completely different from the way that you did, Brendan. Just I don't know.
It's actually interesting. I mean, because of the way that history went, we won't actually know. But one of the things, of course, is Caesar did take up and enjoy the sort of mucking around in Egypt and decadence for a while. But when the people of Rome sort of came back and said, "Ooh, that's a bit iffy. We don't like what you're doing," Caesar immediately went, "Oh, my dignitas," and came home. Whereas Mark Antony, the Roman people and Senate sent him something and said, "We don't like what you're doing," and he went, "Screw it, I like it down here." So once again, different individuals. So I'm going to sort of call it a end for now, but I'm going to let you guys continue to discuss these points. And if you want to also continue discussing these points in Slack, please do. And we can go over some of the questions in there. Lots of references for people who want to continue reading. They're all in the document for those who haven't read it yet or haven't had a copy, but it'll be there. You'll find that I have a rather eclectic sort of combination of things, including old Immanuel Kant. Not my favorite philosopher, but he did actually do a couple good things. So, all right.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Craig.
you very much, Craig.
Thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Greg.
Great. All right.
Great lesson. Thank
Have
you.
a great night, everyone. I'm going to leave
Thank
you
you.
guys to keep discussing.
Thank you
Very much.